2 movies in, we've already reached the end of the Andrew Garfield Amazing Spider-Man duology. Depending on who you are, that may be extremely disappointing, or you may be thinking to yourself, thank fucking God.
You know what it is I love about being Spider-Man? Everything.
Similar to Spider-Man 3, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 has had a long reputation for being a huge mixed bag, and yet another awful example of some of the worst studio middling in superhero film history. All these years later, does that still hold true? Let's find out. To my surprise, actually, I'm not surprised at all. This is pretty much exactly what people all seem to say about it. Whereas with a film like Spider-Man 3, you saw this clear combat between the studio and the director. Sam Raimi is a real artist of a filmmaker, and I feel like he had this true idea of what he wanted to do with Spider-Man 3. So you get to see this fight between creator and studio happening on screen, whereas I don't feel as much of a conflict in terms of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, as I feel like Marc Webb kind of just did a lot of what Sony told him to do with this film. Hence, what we have here is not necessarily a cohesive story by any means, but just a giant splat, just a giant series of setup scenes sort of hodgepodge together in hopes of setting up this Sony Spider-Verse with all these Sinister Six characters, while also trying to convince the audience that they're watching a story by itself. That isn't to say there's nothing of emotional weight or merit in this film. Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone are still great here, although I feel like a lot of their dynamic kind of gets lost in the shuffle since we're setting up all these villain subplots. I also want to say on paper, their relationship is a little bit subpar here compared to the first one, which had a bit more of a focus on their relationship. Here, not only is the relationship one of many cogs in this screenplay, I guess that's what we're calling it, but I also feel like they sort of crammed a trilogy's worth of will they won't they romantic setup into this one movie. The Amazing Spider-Man 1 ended on this note where Peter decided he was going to continue being with Gwen Stacy despite her father urging him not to, but then this film opens up with them together, and then right at the beginning of the movie they break up again. So that sort of just made me feel like it was pointless having them get right back together at the end of The Amazing Spider-Man 1 if we're just gonna lollygag and do the exact same thing here. So instead of feeling like a natural series of narrative events, you sort of just see this weird tug of war between the characters. I feel like the writing between them isn't strong. Again, it's just these actors and their dynamic. They have really great chemistry. That scene where they're first trying to hang out as friends and Peter's like, oh, well, you can't laugh like that if we're just gonna be friends, or you can't do this cute thing with your nose. That was adorable and it felt just improvised. Then it's immediately followed up by this weird scene where we find out that he's following her and stalking her without her knowledge, and she just kind of seems okay with it. What I'm getting at is everything on the page sort of fails miserably. Meanwhile, it's just these actors carrying this movie afloat. We're also introduced to this universe's version of Harry Osborn. Dane DeHaan giving a very cringeworthy performance, if I'm being totally honest. Just a lot of weird, bad, overly serious, stilted dialogue delivery. And I can't help but feel like this movie is struggling to find a motivation for the Green Goblin to hate Spider-Man, because they have to come up with this convoluted disease thing, and I don't know if that's from the comics or not. I've only read a few Spider-Man comics here and there. And we have to have Harry Osborn for some reason convince himself that Spider-Man's blood can save him from this disease, only for Peter to be like, oh, I don't even want to try, it might kill him. Just creating this awkward, contrived tension between them. So now I feel like for almost no reason, Harry just hates Spider-Man in this movie. He's another example similar to Dr. Connors from The Amazing Spider-Man 1, where I can feel like they're trying to add some layers and dimension by giving him what could seem like a sympathetic cause, but none of that explores anything complex, so he just becomes a very two-dimensional villain. Speaking of two-dimensional villains, man, Electro kind of sucks in this movie. I'm actually totally cool with his weird Dr. Manhattan design. I think that's somewhat unique, and it's at least an inspired vision for this character. But man, how many times are we gonna have the whole nerdy supervillain setup where they feel somehow wrong to be betrayed by the hero, so then they turn evil against them? It's just cliche and redundant, and Jamie Foxx, you know, again, like, I can't blame any of the actors here for giving bad performances, especially someone like Jamie Foxx who has a ton of experience. I'm confident that they were just doing what they were directed to do, but man, He's pretty awful in this movie. Just the most stereotypical cartoony portrayal of a nerdy character. And whereas that cartoony tone worked really well with Sam Raimi's universe because it was extremely consistent, here in The Amazing Spider-Man 1, they were setting up a more grounded, realistic version of Spider-Man that could be taken more seriously by modern audiences, only to throw that out the window because The Amazing Spider-Man 1 had a more mixed reception than the first two Sam Raimi Spider-Mans. So here I feel like they try to have their cake and eat it too by bouncing between a more serious storyline but then also having these campy elements like Electro, and also the brief appearance of Paul Giamatti as Rhino, giving a performance where he's clearly chewing the scenery and kind of giving his all. Maybe he was the only actor who really knew how terrible this movie was going to end up. Doesn't excuse the fact that I weirdly feel embarrassed for Paul Giamatti watching this movie. To make me feel that way about an actor like Paul fucking Giamatti is kind of an amazing feat. Whereas Spider-Man 3 had this vast number of subplots and it felt like they were juggling them, trying to give them all their due time, here The Amazing Spider-Man 2 feels like it has a handful of bouncy balls and then just drops them onto a tile floor and lets them bounce off in their own directions, just letting them go wherever they go without any attempt at trying to string them together naturally. Of course, certain things sort of come to a head, but it all ends up being superfluous in the end. I feel like Harry Osborn and Electro's storylines, even though they do find some weird way to contrive them together, I still feel like they have nothing to do with each other. In fact, I feel like Electro you could have just taken entirely out of the story and still had this plot with Peter, Harry, Gwen Stacy, Harry turning into Green Goblin, and then Gwen Stacy, spoilers, dying. Speaking of Gwen Stacy's death, I do feel like that scene is pretty well executed. Yeah, the web becoming a hand is really dumb, but I feel like just more in Andrew Garfield's performance, his reaction feels extremely genuine and it's very gut-wrenching when it happens. There are a few emotional moments in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 that are really effective, namely this really beautiful scene between Peter and Aunt May, where she's refusing to give Peter more information about his parents, and it comes out that she's really just insecure that she wasn't a good enough mother. So Peter has to sit there and reassure her that she has been wonderful and that she is more than enough and it's not about that. Really beautiful, touching human moment that actually weirdly got me choked up. In fact, I'd say that's probably my favorite scene in this entire series. This entire series meaning just these two movies, not out of all the Spider-Man, you know. There's also a really great scene towards the beginning where Spider-Man helps this kid who's being bullied and fix his science project, then walks him home from school. Like, that's just fucking wonderful. Love that shit. Though the way they call back to it at the end, yeah, this kid has the worst mother ever for letting him be so close to the front lines of this Rhino mech, just open firing automatic machine guns at police cars, then just easily letting her son run out to him, and the cops not even trying to stop the kid or help him or anything until Spider-Man gets there. I don't know, that's really fucking dumb. There's a lot of really dumb things in this movie. I think the worst scene in this movie is whenever the film finally remembers, oh yeah, Peter's still trying to look for his missing parents. That's a subplot from the first one that hasn't been followed up on. So just out of nowhere, we have this montage set to this god-awful song that Peter is clearly shown listening to with his headphones, which just makes me fucking hate Peter for having such a shitty normie taste in music. That feels just kind of inconsistent with my vision of Peter Parker. But yeah, if you thought that needle drop in Supergirl was awful and out of place, yeah, that scene ain't got shit on this. The worst moment in this montage being this weird bit where on Peter's entire Charlie Day wall of combined papers, there's this picture of him and Gwen with a sticky note that says, "Don't make me lose you too." Fuck off, movie. That is some of the worst, most obvious screenwriting. You shouldn't be forcing us to make that connection. That should just be the subtext. Peter has a fear of losing people. He lost his uncle, he lost his parents, and now he's scared of losing Gwen because of this guilt complex. Which, by the way they tackled that subject in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man just made a lot more sense to me and made Peter seem like a much more noble character. He didn't even need Mary Jane to have a dead father telling him to leave her out of it. He was just making the conscious, responsible choice to be like, no, I can't risk your life. It wasn't until Mary Jane stood in his doorway and said, no, don't make my decisions for me. You need to trust me to make decisions for myself because I'm a fucking person, that he allowed them to be together. Here, Peter's just on the fence the whole time like, should I get with her? Yeah, I should get with her. No, I shouldn't get with her. It's just really dumb, frustrating, super inconsistent. He's a really hard character to connect with. He should be the relatable anchor point for this giant superhero extravaganza, but he kind of fails on that level. Goes without saying this movie is a mess, even without its weird-ass deleted scenes that I can't believe were ever even considered to be part of this. Similar to the first Amazing Spider-Man, this just reeks of desperation to me. It doesn't come off like they had a singular idea of what they wanted this movie to be, but more like they shot a bunch of different random set pieces, made a bunch of different edits of the movie, did lots of test screenings, then hobbled together this messy final product that we have in hopes that it would maybe come together and maybe make them enough money. But yeah, who would have guessed? This movie underperformed, it underwhelmed critically. I feel like it would be hard to find a Spider-Man fan whose favorite Spider-Man film is The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Despite maybe being a larger failure than something like The Amazing Spider-Man 1, that movie was far less interesting to me because it was much more small scale. It was just a boring, studio-driven, redundant attempt at a superhero origin story with a lot of stuff we've seen before that didn't really feel authentic or original. A lot of those same criticisms hold true for The Amazing Spider-Man 2. In fact, you could say they learned none of the right lessons from The Amazing Spider-Man 1. However, this is a much more ambitious film on every level. I feel like this movie takes much bigger swings than the first Amazing Spider-Man did, and even though most of those swings are misses and don't work out in the end, I feel like The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is this giant, colorful, comic booky splat, and because it is such a giant, ambitious failure, I sort of find it more entertaining and more fascinating as a bad movie. I can't say I hate it. There are authentically stretches of the movie that I sort of enjoy myself watching. I do still largely enjoy Andrew Garfield's take on the character, to the point where I would have been fine with them just plucking this version of Spider-Man and putting him in the MCU. Granted, that's obviously not what happened. Well, not for a few more movies. Of course, we ended up getting Tom Holland and doing his trilogy and whatnot, but I still can't help but feel like this isn't irredeemable, and I guess I would have liked a third Amazing Spider-Man just to make this feel like a more worthwhile experience, because watching these two movies, and especially the second one, and seeing just all this groundwork they were trying to do only to have no payoff to it, does make these two movies almost feel kind of worthless in a lot of ways. Still, for all its flaws, I don't hate The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I think it's kind of fine. I'm gonna give it the same rating I gave The Amazing Spider-Man 1. 5 out of 10. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you have a good one.